So, my name is Jason Silva. I am the creator of Shots of Awe, which hopefully some of you guys have seen. I am also the host of Brain Games on the National Geographic Channel, as well as the show Origins. But where does this all start for me? What is the origin story? Where does the inspiration for my work come from? Where does the agitation for my work come from? Where does the fire in the belly that compels me to so forcefully express myself all the time come from? And the truth of the matter is, it comes from existential angst. Yeah. It comes from just a feeling of sometimes paralyzing fear, occasional dread, wanting to make sense of things, wondering what it's all about, wondering why we're here, wondering what our purpose is in the cosmos. It comes from all of these things. That and 1,000 other neurotic obsessions, I assure you. I remember reading a book by Ernest Becker, Pulitzer Prize-winning book from 1974 called The Denial of Death. And just to give you a pop culture reference for that book, in the movie Annie Hall, it is the book that Woody Allen makes reference to in the bookstore when he wants to buy this book for her. And he says, you have to read this book. It describes my view of the human condition. This book changed my life. This book basically made this case about the human condition. It distilled the human conundrum. It explained the mystery of our being and the mystery of our angst. It was extremely well articulated in a documentary about Ernest Becker's work called Flight from Death, The Quest for Immortality. And the documentary began like this, and it really says it all. To have emerged from nothing, to have a name, consciousness of self, deep inner feeling, an excruciating inner yearning for life and self-expression. And with all this, yet to die. Human beings find themselves in quite the predicament, right? We have the mental capacity to ponder the infinite, seemingly capable of anything. Yet we're housed in these heart-pumping, breath-gasping, decaying bodies, right? Simultaneously gods and worms. Human beings exist at the interplay between the finite and the infinite. The philosopher Tolstoy said, man cannot live if he doesn't find a way to bridge the finite with the infinite. College professor named Sheldon Solomon, also featured in the Ernest Becker documentary, said, the explicit awareness that you're a breathing piece of defecating meat destined to die, and ultimately no more significant than a lizard or a potato, is not especially uplifting. I mean, I memorized that line because I was like, holy shit, that sums it up. People ask me why I have this recall for quotes that resonate. It's because when something explains, when a quote explains something that I have felt more viscerally and artfully than I could have ever done it, I have to retain that quote. I have to own that line. That line is now part of who I am. That line, that quote, that idea now explains how I see the world. And there is reassurance in finding somebody who sees things the way that you do. It makes you feel less alone. It doesn't absolve us of our angst and the mortal coil, but at least it makes us feel like we're all in it together. Others understand. There is consensus that we are in a unique position. We've committed no crime, yet we are afflicted with a death sentence. Now, I've had my share of panic attacks in my life, occasionally from smoking too much pot, but the point being, I've entertained the abyss. I've lost sleep thinking about the end. I worry about people I love getting older. I worry about my parents one day succumbing to mortality. And I am not at peace with this idea. I do not ascribe to any philosophy that accepts death. In fact, as Alan Harrington beautifully wrote in The Immortalist, any philosophy that accepts death must itself be considered dead, its questions meaningless, its consolations worn out. Now, I hope that eventually I discover some philosophy that absolves me from this angst. But at the moment, I love so intensely, I feel so deeply, and I am so attached to the people in my life that I love. I am so attached to having self-awareness, to probing the mysteries of being. I am, in the words of Carl Sagan, a wonder junkie. And I just refuse to surrender that capacity to the forces of entropy, aging, and death. That's where it starts for me. This desire for self-expression, according to Ernest Becker, is one of the 3 solutions to the problem of death. And I'm sorry to start the night with this existential bummer, which, by the way, is the most popular video I've ever done. But the existential bummer is that we are uniquely aware, right? And so Ernest Becker maps out 3 ways in which human beings have dealt with the unique awareness of our mortality. We are the only being in the animal kingdom that can contemplate its own death. So it's not just that we're running away from immediate predators, but that even if everything's awesome, we lose sleep over the fact that one day we will die. One day the sun will eclipse and burn the earth. One day it's all going to end. I mean, that's a bummer and a half as far as I'm concerned. So, how do human beings do this, right? We construct these symbolic systems and we invest ourselves in these systems. We create virtual realities and we invest ourselves in these virtual realities. Or even more appropriately, these real virtualities, because once you commit to these, they become real. They become the lenses through which you see the world. And these reality tunnels, these cultural operating systems, endow our lives with maps of meaning. They give us a directionality. They show the way, right? The first and most impactful solution to the death problem was the virtual reality known as religion. It absolves us of our fear because guess what? You'll live forever in the kingdom of God. Don't worry about this mortality thing. You're set. Sounds great. Sounds amazing. However, if you're a questioning mind that keeps asking questions of your rabbi or your priest, eventually you get kicked out of Sunday school or whatever it may be. And then you turn to maybe science or whatever. The point is, our increasingly secular society finds no alleviation of our ills in religion anymore. So the first solution to the problem of death for many no longer works. The second solution to the problem of death is romantic love. The deification of the other. She's like the wind. She's my salvation. She is the sun. It is every pop song that's ever been written. It is every romantic movie we've ever watched. I can tell you every girl I've ever been in love with fits the archetype from some goddess of cinema that I had a crush on growing up. The iconography of our youth, the images, the album covers, these things become our maps of meaning. When I find the one, she will save me from it all. By deifying, by putting lovers on pedestals, turning them into gods, we have a chance of being saved by rubbing up against them in a moment of extaculation. But guess what? As much as I continue to be a romantic, Ernest Becker reminds us soberly, no relationship can bear the burden of godhood. Ultimately, our gods will reveal their clay feet. Ouch. The cracks in our gods and goddesses are reflections that remind us of our own cracks, and it's like, fuck. What now? The third solution to the problem of death, perhaps the most interesting one, the creative solution to the problem of death. Right? We talked about the religious solution. We talked about the romantic solution. The next one is the creative solution to the problem of death. What can we build? What can we do? What can we create together to overcome, to transcend, to redefine our boundaries, to expand the perimeters of the possible, to overcome our limits, to put things together in a certain way in which things become transcendent? The creative solution to the problem of death is our artistry, our poetry, our instruments, our music, our songs, our films, our rocket ships and satellites and iPhones, miracles of engineering in which we engender our own divinity increasingly and forcefully. My passion for technology comes from an abiding belief that technology is the embodiment of human creativity in the world. Technology is the literalization of human imagination in the world. Technology becomes the human mind turned inside out. And as Kevin Kelly from Wired magazine said, imagine how impoverished the world would be if we didn't invent the technology of the oil painting in time for Van Gogh, or the technology of the musical instrument in time for Beethoven and Mozart, or the technology of the written word in time for Shakespeare. These tools and technologies become conduits for new forms of human creativity, new forms of human flourishing that, for a moment at least, allow us to transcend our animality and become our triumph over death. This is my abiding belief in human creativity, the most metaphysical of metaphysical qualities, perhaps and increasingly allowing us to modify our own evolution. I give a lot of lectures around the world about disruptive technologies. People in Silicon Valley are getting wet with the idea of the singularity. Billionaires can taste technologically mediated immortality. This stuff is within our grasp. We don't just build rocket ships that take us to other planets. We don't just build cell phones in which we warp space and time in a form of technologically mediated telepathy where minds can communicate with each other across oceans of sky. We don't just do this. These exponential technologies, which have shrunk supercomputers the size of buildings into devices in our pockets, are now spilling over into biotechnology, which means mastering the information processes of our biology, because it turns out that we are made of code. That biology is language, is software that writes its own hardware. We are made of language. We are linguistic all the way down. We are alphabetic beings. And now we're learning to reprogram that language. Our existential angst, our refusal to accept our fate is now giving us the tools to rewrite the very code of life, to change the terms we didn't sign up for. We'll create new software apps for biology and say, this cancer thing, screw that shit. Human beings don't die of illness anymore. This aging thing, fuck that. Here's another 1,000 years to learn, explore, and probe the galaxy. The speed at which we can sequence our genes today is going 3 times faster than these exponential growth curves that they love talking about in Silicon Valley. In other words, the 40 years that it took to take a supercomputer to shrink down from half a building to a phone in your pocket, right? That exponential growth curve is happening in biotech. Gene sequencing is going 3 times faster than Moore's Law. This is the kind of progress. This feels like an inevitability. It feels like creativity and technology in a symbiotic way, have a directionality. There seems to be a teleological move towards greater complexity and organization. Kevin Kelly from Wired magazine calls technology the technium. He calls it the 7th kingdom of life. He says it's alive. He says it has wants and it has needs, and it's pulling towards greater forms of novelty, engendering more possibilities, more creativity, more imagination, increasing our options. Eric Davis says, when everything becomes linked with everything else, matter becomes mind. We're seeing the rise of artificial intelligence, non-biological minds in marriage with us, increasing intelligence beyond its biological limitations. So now we are a hybrid. Now we are a cyborg of biological and non-biological intelligence. In fact, there's a whole school of cognitive philosophers, namely David Chalmers and Andy Clark, that say that we have a skin bag bias in assuming that we are nature and technology is not. That in fact, technology is a second skin. Technology is our scaffolding, and that the mind, that intelligence exists instead in the feedback loops between brains, tools, and environment. So we are already part something else. Part biology and part something else. Again, we start with the human condition. We start with the fire in the belly. We start with existential dread. We start with what the fuck do we do with ourselves, right? First we pray. Then we worship our lovers. Finally, we get really creative and we surprise ourselves in realizing we contain wonders, that we are capable of achieving the impossible. Stephen Johnson, in his book, Where Good Ideas Come From, A Natural History of Innovation, talks about the adjacent possible. The adjacent possible is a shadow from the future that hovers over the present and provides a map of all the ways in which the present can reinvent itself. How do we tap into that adjacent possible? A lot to think about. So I want to show you a video to set up our initial condition as we walk through some of my work and some of the ways in which I've dealt with this situation. Please show the first video.
All is temporary. Even our greatest ecstasies are tinged by a bit of darkness. This moment will pass. This moment will end. I may have lost her. I may have lost this moment. But now I have this piece of content that I can always go back to remind me of the intensity of that. I will not just forget this. I will not forget you. For me, a life well lived is a life that is not about victories or losses, but about a continuous process of growth, a continuous process of adventure, curiosity, and awe. One in which you don't go quietly into that good night at the end of the race, but instead you rage and rage and rage against the dying of the light. As Ellen Harrington said, we must never forget we are cosmic revolutionaries, not stooges conscripted to advance a natural order that kills everyone. Having invented the gods, we can turn into them.